March 8, 2014, 1:19 in the morning. The final radio call leaves the cockpit of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. The captain's voice is calm, routine, exactly what air traffic controllers expect to hear at the boundary between two flight information regions. Seconds later, the aircraft disappears from civilian radar. For years, that moment has been described as the point where MH370 vanished, but it didn't. Not completely. The radar target was gone. The flight number disappeared. The routine stream of information that identifies an aircraft simply stopped. Yet something else continued. Hour after hour, long after controllers had lost contact, a satellite high above the Indian Ocean kept receiving brief automated signals from the aircraft. No distress call, no voice, no position report, just silent acknowledgments that something aboard the Boeing 777 was still alive. If those signals are correct, then MH370 remained airborne for almost 6 more hours after the world believed it had disappeared. That single fact changes everything. Because an aircraft cannot fly itself into one of the most remote regions on Earth without following some kind of path. Someone or something kept it moving. Investigators have spent years reconstructing that invisible journey from scattered clues, a final transmission, a missing transponder, faint satellite handshakes, and a trail of evidence spread across an entire ocean. Together, they reveal a flight that did not simply vanish. They reveal a flight that continued long after it was supposed to be gone. The question is no longer where MH370 disappeared. The question is, who, or what, was still flying it through the darkness. If you enjoy aviation investigations built on evidence instead of speculation, you're in the right place. Subscribe, because every document, radar return, and satellite signal we'll examine changes the picture before it. This isn't the story of a missing airplane. It's the reconstruction of a flight that kept rewriting its own investigation, one clue at a time. Before we examine what went wrong, we need to understand what should have happened. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 was a scheduled overnight service from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, a route flown countless times without incident. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, one of the world's most reliable long-haul airliners. Designed with multiple redundant systems and an exceptional safety record, it was built to continue flying safely even when individual components failed. Nothing about the flight plan stood out. The weather along the planned route was favorable. There were no significant storms requiring deviations, no reports of severe turbulence, and no operational warnings suggesting the crew would face an unusual workload after departure. Inside the cockpit, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid prepared for another routine sector. Together, they carried thousands of hours of flight experience. Every checklist, every clearance, and every radio exchange followed procedures that airline crews practiced throughout their careers. At 12:42 in the morning, MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport and began climbing toward its assigned cruising altitude. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft along its planned route across the South China Sea toward Vietnam. On radar screens, it was just another scheduled flight joining one of Southeast Asia's busiest international air corridors. From the perspective of controllers, everything unfolded exactly as expected. The aircraft climbed normally. Its navigation remained on course. Radio communication was clear. No emergency was declared. No unusual maneuver was requested. No system reported trouble. In commercial aviation, flights constantly transition between different air traffic control sectors. As an aircraft approaches the edge of one controller's airspace, responsibility is handed to the next controller along the route. It is a routine process, repeated thousands of times every day, usually lasting only a few seconds. MH370 was approaching that routine handoff. Nothing in the cockpit suggested urgency. Nothing on the radar suggested danger. Nothing in the weather hinted at what was coming. If investigators had frozen the timeline at that moment, there would have been no reason to expect this flight would become aviation's greatest modern mystery. And yet, with the aircraft only moments away from changing frequencies, only 102 seconds remained before everything changed. At 1:19 in the morning, Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control issued a routine instruction: Malaysian 370. Contact Ho Chi Minh on 120.9. Good night. The reply came back immediately. Good night, Malaysian 370. Nothing in the captain's voice suggested stress. There was no urgency, no hesitation, no request to deviate from the flight plan. To everyone listening, it sounded like the end of another ordinary frequency change. Then the timeline begins to fracture. Just 17 seconds after that final transmission, the aircraft's transponder stopped broadcasting. A transponder is not radar. It doesn't detect the aircraft. Instead, it continuously tells air traffic control exactly what the aircraft is, its identity, altitude, and other essential flight information. Without it, controllers no longer see a labeled aircraft. They see only an anonymous radar return, if radar coverage exists at all. To civilian controllers, MH370 simply disappeared from their screens. But another system had also gone quiet. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, better known as ACARS, had stopped sending its routine reports. ACARS automatically transmits operational data between an aircraft and the airline, including maintenance information and position updates. Losing both systems within moments of each other was immediately unusual. Individually, either event might have been explained. Together, they formed a sequence. Final radio call. Transponder lost. ACARS silent. Civilian radar contact gone. Investigators would spend years asking whether that sequence could happen during a sudden emergency, or whether it reflected deliberate actions taken inside the cockpit. Meanwhile, something else complicated the picture. Civilian radar and military radar do not work the same way. Civilian air traffic control relies primarily on secondary surveillance radar, which depends on an aircraft's transponder replying to interrogation signals. Once the transponder stopped responding, the detailed target disappeared. Military primary radar is different. It does not require the aircraft's cooperation. It simply detects physical objects by reflecting radio waves from them. That distinction would become critical. Because while civilian controllers believed MH370 had vanished, the aircraft itself had not. At first, neither Kuala Lumpur nor Ho Chi Minh controllers fully understood what had happened. Each assumed the aircraft was still communicating with the other. Those precious minutes slipped away before anyone realized the flight was no longer responding. By then, the investigation was already following the wrong assumption. MH370 had not fallen from the sky. It had only disappeared from the system designed to identify it. The airplane itself was still there. The question was where it was going. If the investigation had ended with civilian radar, MH370 would have been recorded as an aircraft that simply vanished near the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. But it didn't end there. When investigators examined Malaysia's military primary radar, a different picture emerged. The unidentified radar return was still moving. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, the aircraft made a sharp left turn, crossed back over the Malay Peninsula, and headed west toward the Strait of Malacca. This was no random drift. The turns were smooth, controlled, and consistent with an aircraft being actively navigated. Commercial airliners can follow routes with remarkable precision using the Flight Management System, or FMS. Pilots can enter a sequence of waypoints into the system, allowing the aircraft to fly a programmed path with little control input. Whether those waypoints had been entered before departure or changed in flight would become one of the investigation's most important questions. The route itself raised even more. MH370 wasn't heading toward Beijing anymore. It wasn't descending toward the nearest airport. It wasn't broadcasting an emergency. It was flying away from its planned destination, while remaining completely silent. As the radar track continued west, it passed near Penang Island, where Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had grown up. Some independent analysts later argued that the overflight carried significance. Others dismissed it as coincidence. The available evidence cannot determine intent, only the aircraft's path. That distinction matters. The radar tells investigators where the aircraft went. It cannot explain why. For nearly an hour, military radar continued to paint the anonymous target as it crossed the peninsula and entered the Strait of Malacca. Then, just as unexpectedly as it had reappeared, it was gone again, not because the aircraft vanished, because it had flown beyond the reach of radar coverage. From that point onward, no ground-based radar could reliably follow it. The investigation had uncovered something extraordinary. MH370 had not suffered an immediate catastrophic failure after its final radio call. Someone, or something, had reversed course, navigated across an entire country, and continued flying with deliberate precision. That single discovery forced investigators to abandon their original assumptions. The search was no longer for an aircraft lost near its last radio transmission. It was now for an aircraft that had intentionally, or inexplicably, come back, crossed Malaysia unseen by civilian controllers, and disappeared once more beyond the Strait of Malacca, leaving investigators with a new and far more difficult question. Where did it go after the radar ended? Once MH370 disappeared beyond military radar, investigators faced a problem that seemed impossible. There was no radar coverage, no radio transmissions, no emergency beacon, no eyewitnesses. By every conventional measure, the aircraft had become invisible. Then an unexpected source of evidence emerged, not from air traffic control, not from the airline, but from a communications satellite more than 35,000 kilometers above Earth. Every hour, the aircraft's satellite communications system attempted a routine network exchange with an Inmarsat satellite. These brief automated contacts were never designed to track airplanes. They contained no latitude, no longitude, and no flight path. They simply confirmed that the aircraft's terminal was still responding. These exchanges became known as the satellite handshakes. At first, they appeared almost useless. They answered only one question. Was the aircraft still powered? Yes. An hour later? Yes again. Then again. And again. Each handshake quietly extended the timeline. 1 hour. 2 hours. 3. By the time the final complete handshake was received, investigators realized something extraordinary. MH370 had remained airborne for approximately 6 hours after disappearing from radar, but knowing the aircraft was still flying was only half the puzzle. The next challenge was determining where. Engineers turned to two measurements hidden within the satellite signals themselves. The first was burst timing offset, or BTO. Every signal takes a measurable amount of time to travel between the aircraft and the satellite. That tiny delay allowed investigators to estimate the aircraft's distance from the satellite at each handshake. Not its exact position, but a broad arc across the Earth's surface. Each hourly handshake produced another arc. Instead of a single location, investigators now had a series of enormous curved lines stretching across thousands of kilometers. The aircraft had to be somewhere along each one. Then came the second measurement, burst frequency offset, or BFO. As the aircraft moved, the frequency of the radio signal shifted slightly because of the Doppler effect, the same physical principle that changes the pitch of a passing siren. By comparing the expected frequency with the one actually received, engineers could estimate whether the aircraft was moving toward the satellite or away from it. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. The timing data suggested where the aircraft could be. The frequency data suggested the direction it had been traveling. When those measurements were combined with fuel endurance, aircraft performance, and known radar information, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The flight had not turned north into Central Asia. It had continued south, into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean. It was an extraordinary reconstruction built from signals never intended for navigation. Yet it remained exactly that, a reconstruction. The satellite could not reveal who was in control. It could not show the aircraft's altitude. It could not explain why the route had changed. It could only trace the invisible outline of a journey no radar had witnessed. The satellite solved the mystery of whether MH370 had continued flying. In doing so, it created an even larger one. If investigators now knew the direction of the flight, why was finding the aircraft still proving almost impossible? The satellite analysis narrowed the possibilities. It did not reveal a crash site. Instead, investigators were left with a series of probability lines stretching across one of the most remote oceans on Earth. Somewhere beneath those arcs lay the aircraft. The problem was deciding where to begin. Search planning became an investigation of its own. Every assumption carried consequences. If the aircraft maintained a constant speed, the search shifted one way. If it slowed near fuel exhaustion, the priority moved somewhere else. If strong winds altered its track, the calculations changed again. Even small differences multiplied over 6 hours of flight. The search area kept moving because the evidence itself kept evolving. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau eventually took a leading role in refining the underwater search. Rather than relying on a single clue, analysts combined satellite data, aircraft performance, fuel consumption, radar information, and engineering models to identify the most likely impact corridor. Nothing about the process was certain. It was probability, layered upon probability. Once the search moved underwater, another challenge emerged. The southern Indian Ocean is among the least explored places on the planet. In many areas, the seabed lies more than 4,000 meters below the surface. Mountains, trenches, and volcanic ridges rise from the ocean floor, creating terrain as complex as anything on land. Search vessels slowly mapped the seabed with side-scan sonar, building detailed images of terrain no human had ever seen before. Day after day, the ocean revealed shipwrecks, geological formations, and countless false targets. But not MH370. Then came another shift in the investigation. Debris found thousands of kilometers away offered a new source of evidence. Oceanographers began drift modeling, working backward from where fragments washed ashore. By combining ocean currents, seasonal winds, and floating behavior, they estimated where those pieces might have entered the water months earlier. Like the satellite analysis, drift modeling could not produce an exact location. It could only narrow the possibilities. Every refinement improved the search. Every refinement also acknowledged that the previous assumptions had been incomplete. Years passed. Search zones expanded. Others were abandoned. Millions of square kilometers of ocean had been examined through radar analysis, satellite mathematics, sonar surveys, and ocean science. Yet the aircraft itself remained beyond reach. The investigation had become a race between evidence and uncertainty. With every new calculation, investigators understood the flight a little better, but the one thing they needed most, the wreckage on the ocean floor, continued to evade them. For more than a year, the investigation had one overwhelming problem. There was no aircraft. Every conclusion rested on radar data, satellite calculations, and probability models. Then, on a beach on Réunion Island in the western Indian Ocean, that changed. A weathered aircraft component washed ashore. It was a flaperon. On a Boeing 777, the flaperon combines the functions of a flap and an aileron. It helps generate lift during takeoff and landing, while also assisting the aircraft in rolling from side to side. More importantly for investigators, every major aircraft component carries identifying features that can be traced. This one could. Investigators concluded it belonged to MH370. Over time, additional fragments appeared along coastlines across the western Indian Ocean. A flap section, interior panels, pieces from the engine nacelle. Some components were conclusively identified. Others were judged highly likely to have come from the aircraft. For the first time, the investigation possessed physical evidence. It confirmed something that had only been inferred before. MH370 had reached the Indian Ocean, but that confirmation answered only one question: where? It did not explain how the flight ended. Attention quickly shifted from what had been found to how it had been damaged. The flaperon became one of the most closely examined pieces of wreckage in modern aviation. Some investigators argued that the fracture patterns suggested the aircraft struck the water under some degree of control. They pointed to comparatively limited damage on parts of the leading edge and shearing along sections of the trailing edge, proposing that the airplane may have been deliberately ditched rather than plunging uncontrolled into the sea. Others disagreed. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau concluded the available debris did not support such certainty. In its assessment, the damage remained consistent with a high-energy impact after fuel exhaustion, and the recovered pieces simply could not reconstruct the aircraft's final attitude or the actions of whoever, or whatever, was controlling it. The disagreement mattered, because both interpretations accepted the same evidence. They simply reached different conclusions. Without the main wreckage, there was no way to examine the engines, the cockpit, the flight controls, or the positions of critical systems at impact. The debris had survived the ocean. The answers had not. Ironically, the wreckage strengthened confidence in the satellite analysis, while preserving the central mystery. It confirmed investigators had been searching in the right ocean. It could not tell them what happened during the final minutes of flight. Even after years of searching, the physical evidence refused to deliver a single, uncontested ending. The ocean had returned pieces of the airplane, not the truth investigators were still trying to assemble. By this point, the investigation has established several facts with reasonable confidence. The aircraft stopped communicating in a deliberate sequence. It turned away from its planned route. It remained airborne for approximately 6 hours. It ended somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. Everything else is measured against those facts. The first possibility is mechanical failure. A fire in the cockpit or avionics bay has often been suggested. An onboard emergency could explain an immediate turn back toward Malaysia, as pilots are trained to head for the nearest suitable airport when smoke or fire threatens the aircraft. At first, that appears plausible, but the sequence becomes difficult to reconcile. A fire might disable electrical systems. It does not readily explain why the transponder stopped transmitting before the aircraft followed a controlled route across the peninsula, nor does it fully explain why the aircraft continued flying for hours with no distress call. The theory answers some questions. Not enough of them. Another proposal involves hypoxia. If the cabin lost pressure at high altitude, everyone without supplemental oxygen would gradually lose consciousness. Airliners carry passenger oxygen masks, but they are designed to provide only enough oxygen while the aircraft descends to breathable altitude. If that descent never happens, the masks eventually stop supplying oxygen. The flight crew's oxygen supply is different. Their masks connect to dedicated oxygen bottles, capable of supporting the pilots for much longer. An accidental depressurization has historical precedent. Helios Airways Flight 522 demonstrated how an airliner can continue flying after the crew becomes incapacitated. But MH370 presents a different challenge. Its route remained remarkably consistent. The turns followed established navigation points rather than random headings. If everyone had become incapacitated early in the flight, investigators would expect the aircraft to continue on whatever course the autopilot had already been instructed to fly. Instead, the evidence suggests that significant navigation changes occurred after communications were lost. Then there is hijacking. A forced takeover could explain deliberate route changes and prolonged flight, yet investigators found no verified evidence of passengers or outside actors controlling the aircraft. No organization made a credible claim of responsibility. The debris also strongly supports an end in the Indian Ocean rather than a hidden landing elsewhere, weakening many early hijacking scenarios. One piece of evidence continued to attract particular attention: Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah's home flight simulator. Investigators recovered deleted data showing a simulated route that extended deep into the southern Indian Ocean. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau confirmed that the recovered simulator information was considered during search planning because of similarities to the projected path of MH370. That finding is significant. It is not the same as proof. Flight simulator sessions often contain incomplete routes, experiments, and scenarios unrelated to actual flights. The recovered data cannot establish motive, intent, or what happened inside the cockpit on the night of the disappearance. It is evidence, not a verdict. When investigators compare every major hypothesis against the known timeline, a pattern begins to emerge. Mechanical failure explains the turn, but struggles to explain the communication shutdowns and prolonged flight. Accidental hypoxia explains silence, but not the apparent precision of the navigation. Hijacking explains deliberate control, but lacks supporting evidence after years of investigation. Human intervention from within the cockpit aligns with more elements of the known evidence than any other single explanation. It is consistent with the sequence of system losses, the controlled route change, and the extended flight reconstructed from satellite data. Even so, important questions remain unanswered. Who was at the controls during the final hours? If the aircraft remained under active control, what was the intended destination? Or was there ever one? Did the flight continue on autopilot after fuel exhaustion became inevitable, or did someone remain in command until the very end? Without the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, those questions cannot be answered with certainty. The investigation does not end with one theory defeating all the others. It ends with one possibility fitting the greatest number of verified facts, while still leaving the most important moments hidden beneath the Indian Ocean. That is the distinction that has defined MH370 from the beginning. The evidence narrows the possibilities. It does not eliminate the mystery. After years of analysis, one conclusion stands above all the theories. MH370 did not simply disappear. Investigators rebuilt much of its final journey, from fragments of evidence that were never intended to solve an aviation mystery. Radar returns, satellite handshakes, aircraft performance data, fuel calculations, ocean current modeling, and recovered debris each revealed part of the story. Together, they transformed an invisible flight into a remarkably detailed reconstruction. But reconstruction is not the same as certainty. There are still two witnesses that have never been heard: the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. Better known as the black boxes, they are actually painted bright orange to improve visibility during recovery. One continuously records thousands of aircraft parameters: engine performance, flight control inputs, autopilot modes, system status, and countless other data points. The other preserves the sounds inside the cockpit, from radio transmissions to warning alarms and conversations between the flight crew. Those recorders do not speculate. They do not interpret. They simply preserve what happened. If recovered, they could answer questions that have remained unresolved for more than a decade. Who made the final course changes? Was the aircraft under manual control during its last moments? Did a mechanical failure occur that investigators have never been able to detect? Or did the evidence already point investigators as close to the truth as anyone could reasonably expect? The difficulty is not understanding their importance. It is reaching them. The southern Indian Ocean is vast, remote, and extraordinarily unforgiving. In many areas, the seabed lies more than 4 kilometers below the surface, beneath rugged underwater terrain. Searching there is less like finding a needle in a haystack than finding a single object in a mountain range hidden beneath permanent darkness. Every unsuccessful search has reduced uncertainty. None has eliminated it. That is why MH370 occupies such a unique place in aviation history. It is not the absence of evidence that keeps the mystery alive. It is the existence of evidence that cannot quite reach the final answer. The radar explains part of the flight. The satellites explain another. The debris confirms the aircraft reached the Indian Ocean. Yet the decisive moments, the ones that define why 239 people never arrived in Beijing, remain locked beyond direct observation. In aviation accident investigation, conclusions are built by eliminating impossible explanations until only the most probable remain. With MH370, investigators have done exactly that. They have narrowed the possibilities. They have reconstructed the route. They have identified patterns that are difficult to ignore. But probability, however compelling, is not proof. Somewhere beneath the southern Indian Ocean rests the final chapter of this investigation. Until those orange recorders are found, or until new evidence emerges, the last moments of Flight MH370 will remain suspended between what is known and what can only be inferred. Perhaps investigators have already come as close to the truth as anyone ever will. Or perhaps, 4 kilometers beneath the waves, the final answer has been waiting all along.